Okay.
So before we go live, could you also make sure that we have a live stream, that the chat is enabled?
Yes, I'll manage that just now. Why is this? Can you see if you're live now?
I can only see the thumbnail. I cannot see the actual. I cannot see us.
That's so strange because it now says, oh, now, yes, now it's working on the YouTube. Yeah, you're now live and I will enable the chat. Can you see if you're live now?
I cannot see us being live. You see the thumbnail. I cannot see the. So Agnieszka, what we can do, we can start and we can, this is being recorded. So if we are not successful through live streaming, we can also just post it unless you would like to postpone, because I cannot see us being on YouTube.
No, Barbara, we are on YouTube. We are. I can see us. I can just hear you talking.
That's great. Probably that's my very bad internet connection that I cannot see. In any case, let me then open officially our event and apologize everyone who managed to connect on time for these technical problems. I think we are all familiar with them. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barbara Warwas, and I'm a lecturer in multi-level regulation and director of the Center of Expertise on Global Governance at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to our conversation with Dr. Agnieszka Kubal, who is a lecturer in sociology at the University College London. Dr. Kubal is an interdisciplinary socio-legal scholar, but also migration and human rights scholar with area studies interests in Central and Eastern Europe and Russia. She is the author of 2 monographs, Socio-Legal Integration, Polish Post-2004 EU Enlargement, Migrants in the UK, published by Ashgate Radlich, and Immigration and Refugee Law in Russia, Socio-Legal Perspective, published by Cambridge University Press. Welcome, Dr. Kubal. Agnieszka, if I may, it's a real pleasure to have you here with us today. And let me, before we give you the floor and before we start with our questions, let me also mention that this event is organized by the Center of Expertise on Global Governance within the series of events on women's reproductive rights in Poland and beyond, following the decision of the Polish Constitutional Court on abortion law of 22nd October 2020. So our discussion today will revolve around the following topics. First, your research interests, then we will zoom in into the situation in Poland, and then we will try to discuss the understanding of women's rights as human rights. And of course, I hope that there are no technical problems or they are minimized, and that we will be also able to see questions via chat. If not, we will also proceed with our conversation. So again, Agnieszka, welcome. It's great to have you. Maybe we can start with with an opening question referring to the title of this event, because the title of this event is inspired and refers to the project "Who are the humans behind the human rights?" for which you were recently awarded a grant by the British Academy. So, who is the woman behind the women's rights? Project, and maybe you could start by telling us something more about your research in more general terms.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Barbara, for having me. Thank you for this lovely introduction. I thought I'll share my screen just to show you a few pictures, because talking about human rights just in legal terms can be a bit boring. And I've just also realized, Barbara, after introducing me, that both my book titles are far too long, and I should have sought expert advice on naming my books, because they are mouthful. Anyway, so going to my current research, what interested me in the women behind the women rights is the fact that if we look at the cases to the European Court of Human Rights submitted from only a handful of Eastern European countries, they amount to over 50% of all the cases submitted to the European Court of Human Rights. So, of course, Russia is let's say, the most notorious applicant to the European Court of Human Rights, but followed closely by Ukraine and Romania, which is an EU country, and then Hungary and Poland. Okay, the 2% for both Hungary and Poland are not very representative, because this is a number that fluctuates. Poland always had a very big presence in terms of number of cases submitted to the European Court of Human Rights. However, even though these countries and Poland among them apply in great numbers to the European Court of Human Rights, over 90% of these cases are so-called failed cases. So they never reach a judgment state. When the court receives them, the judge who reviews the cases either finds them inadmissible, or these cases are later struck down from the register. So if the human rights claims are made, but they never materialize, what are the consequences for the societies? And as a social legal scholar, to me, that's a very interesting question, because that's a question that sort of takes our focus from the law, from the judgment, and zooms more onto the people. So onto those who apply to the European Court of Human Rights, and yet they never get anything back, because the cases are struck down or are deemed inadmissible. So staying within that, to me, those applications really create a window into the society. They can be recognized in Durkheimian's terms as a social fact. What do those cases really mean for the society, for the development of Polish society, or the development of Eastern European societies? And to answer this question, I realized I should not really look at the judgments. I should not really look at the text of those applications, but I should speak to the people. I should speak to the people who put those applications. And here I have a picture of you of the leaders or the activists. So the activists will be, of course, the human rights activists, the women rights activists will be the first group of people I would like to talk to. These are the ones who organize the biggest strikes and the biggest demonstrations in Poland in the immediate aftermath of the Constitutional Tribunal judgment on women's reproductive rights in Poland in October last year. These are the leaders of the NGO or white social movement called Strajk Kobiet, or Women's Strike. And they've been quite crucial and influential in organizing the protests, not only in the immediate aftermath of the most recent decision of the Constitutional Tribunal, but also far earlier, whenever the so-called abortion compromise was to be compromised, for a lack of a better term, or whenever that was to be affected by the different dynamics within the Polish parliament. So these are definitely the women who stand behind women's rights in Poland, and with whom I would like to speak to about their experiences of how do they perceive the role of the European Court of Human Rights. But others, and on the right-hand side here, you can see the picture of the biggest protests in Warsaw that happened in the immediate aftermath. So it's not only the women who organized it, but the everyday people, the women who took part in those protests. These will be also the women behind the human rights in Poland. These would be the people who, you know, in the middle of the pandemic, took it to the streets to say, no, the government does not have right to my body. There were lots of wonderful slogans or that the demonstrator had. Because we have an English speaking audience, I decided to use the English ones because of the international media. The language of those slogans on those was from, was in English, was in Polish. So this one refers to the current leader of the Law and Justice Party, Mr. Kaczynski, who should keep 2-meter distance from my uterus. It's a funny play of words on the pandemic, what's going on in the pandemic and the social distancing, as well as sort of a backlash of, a rather eloquent backlash against the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal. So everyday people who went to the streets, took to the streets to protests. And I must say that 70% of the Polish society, according to the Kantar polling in November, supported these protests, even though, as I said, it was in the middle of the second wave of the pandemic. This is another very famous slogan from the protests, which is a play on the French liberté, égalité, fraternité. Here, fraternité has been replaced by a rather word that I should censor, knowing that we are recorded, but in English would be, the translation would be liberty, equality, and get the fuck out of here, meaning that's a message to the government. But also women like her, who in the immediate aftermath of the European Court of Constitutional Tribunal judgment, took part in a mass and wide protest by sending individual applications to the European Court of Human Rights. Here on that picture, of course, the eyes of the applicant are very important, but also what she's holding. And what she's holding is essentially an A4 size envelope addressed to the European Court of Human Rights registry, in which she has put an individual application against the decision. Again, this is an application that more demonstrates the need for the activists, the need for the people to get the European Court of Human Rights involved. I think more symbolically at that moment, symbolically due to the fact that at the moment we haven't heard of cases of women yet being denied abortion on the back of this law, which means we don't have a victim yet. So a victim, a person who could apply. A lot of women, like the woman on the picture, have applied to express their symbolic protest. And that's the protest also against the way that decision of the Constitutional Tribunal has been taken by what is being perceived by many people in Poland and abroad at the European Union level as a very politicized Constitutional Tribunal, as a Constitutional Tribunal that does not necessarily adhere to the tripartite division of power between executive, judicial, and legislative, right? Basically, as a constitutional tribunal that has been staffed with judges that were elected by the dominant political party. So I would like to talk to women like her, But I would also like to talk to the lawyers who helped or who organized legal help for people who in the middle of those protests were taken by the police. So because that can give rise to a number of applications to the European Court of Human Rights on the basis of right to peaceful assembly, which is or right to fair trial, for example, which is Article 6. So these lawyers, both lawyers who work within Poland, like this Spila, okay, how to translate it into English? It's a pin. So it's a group of human rights feminist lawyers who helped women who were during the peaceful protest in Poland taken by the police, but also human rights lawyers like those associated with the Fundacja Helsińska, which is the Helsinki Foundation, who which is a very established organization that consists of lawyers that put applications to the European Court of Human Rights, and many of those applications are actually successful. So looking at the people who can be the victims, looking at the people who are the important stakeholders in that conflict around women reproductive rights as human rights, looking at the lawyers and looking at the social activists. These would be my women behind the women's rights in Poland.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Sounds really interesting. I have a question also from this maybe sociological perspective, but also historical perspective. If you could tell us a little bit more about your interest in Central and Eastern Europe and Russia, and whether you see that where is Poland heading now? Because Poland is part of the post-Soviet bloc, and of course you mentioned that the need of Polish women to be heard also before the European Court of Human Rights. But where is Poland heading, and can you see any similarities from your past research also regarding the reproductive rights or the position or status of Poland in this part of the world?
Thank you very much, Barbara. I would say that Poland, until very recently, at least until 2015, was one of the sort of glorious boys of the 1989 transition. So we have joined our transition to market economy from the socialist state planned economy was considered to be maybe not seamless, because we of course know of the victims of that transition, but was going in a way towards liberal market economy. The same, Poland joined NATO, Poland joined the European Union, and then suddenly around 2015 we see a backlash against those sort of political ideals and political values, liberal democracy values. And that seemed to revolve around the law and justice and the right-wing parties coming to power in Poland. And not only coming to power, democracy is the nature of democracy is that people who are voted in take the power. However, the idea of democracy is that, okay, later on you might be able to vote somebody out if they do not necessarily conform to your original ideas and values, etc. However, with the ascension to power of law and justice, you can see a steady decline of the Polish institutions. You can see political institutions. You can see, as I mentioned, the separation of the powers to executive, legislative, and judicial is being very much muddled. And these started literally a couple of months after Law and Justice came to power. They hijacked, we could say hijacked, the Constitutional Tribunal, which gave the decision on the Polish women reproductive rights last October. They staffed it with their own judges, so judges elected by the parliamentary majority. They staffed it with judges, they removed judges whose end of the term has not yet came, which means that you have double judges on different on the bench. You have double judges on the bench. So those who were supposed to be hearing still the cases whose term has not ended, and the new judges who have been put in their place because their term has been put to an end by the parliamentary majority. So you see a steady decline of the rule of law in Poland, which changes the rules of the game. You know, and that sort of makes me think that any new type of election or bringing back the pre-2015 rules of the game would be is a much tougher challenge. It's not only a challenge of having a fair elections, but it's also a challenge of having elections against rules that are basically stuck against you, right? That favor the ruling coalition at the moment. So how to translate it now to the women reproductive rights in Eastern Europe? I would say that Poland had one of the strictest laws in Eastern Europe already. And I want to, it's quite dry to talk about laws. So let me move to a slide when I can show you that it was the so-called 1993 family planning law. And given that law, or this was the so-called abortion compromise. The termination of pregnancy in Poland was legal only in 3 instances. So first, when the pregnancy endangered the mother's life or health, when the prenatal test or other medical findings indicate that there was high risk that the fetus would be severely and irreversibly damaged, and 3, that there were strong grounds believing that the pregnancy was a result of rape or incest. At the moment, what the Constitutional Tribunal did was removed the second condition of legal abortion in Poland, which is literally taking all reproductive rights of women in Poland, because 98% of all abortions were on the basis of the second exclusion. So lots of international media outlets highlighted that okay, now 98% of abortions will be impossible in Poland. But if you take into account, if you look at this, I mean, 98%, it's a huge number, obviously. So were these Polish women so reckless that they had so many abortions? Okay, that's the problem of talking about percentages. That's the problem of talking about percentages. So now let me put my hat as a sociologist and give you a context to those numbers, because according to the official Ministry of Health statistics, abortions in Poland, the official abortions in Poland, are very low to start with. So in 2019, there were 1,110 abortions. Yeah, out of this, 1,074 took place because of the high risk of severe fetal abnormality. So we are talking about 1,000 abortions per year. And how does it compare to another Catholic country in Europe, Ireland, where in 2019, the same year, there were over 6,000 legal abortions? Or let's say our immediate neighbor, a much smaller country in terms of the population. Poland has 38 million people. Czech Republic, just to the south of Poland, has 9 to 10 million people. And in Czech Republic in 2018 alone, there were 18,000 abortions. So we are talking 1,000 legal abortions in Poland versus 18,000 abortions in Czech Republic. So again, then the Polish women do not take the decision to legal abortion lightly. And if they do, they have legal reasons to do so, like those resulting from the 1993 Family Planning Act.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. This is really interesting, and also thank you for telling us more about the statistic. But maybe to play the role of a evils or the devil's advocate, I think I would like to ask, how will you represent the voice of the government or politicians in your research? Because of course, it's very important to focus on individual stories too. But as we know, of course, women's rights all over the world, are political issues. So are you planning also to reflect on the voice of the state, or are you focusing only on the sociological perspective?
The voice of the state is everywhere. The voice of the state is dominant at the moment in that debate. The voice of the state is dominant. Why? Because the ruling coalition, the ruling party, has got the state media. So any type of discourse analysis of the state media, or the that is the or both audiovisual or online media demonstrate that the state narrative is omnipresent. What I think would be more interesting in to listen and to, I completely agree with you. We need to have the counterfactual. We need to have that voice, maybe not necessarily balanced, but have the other side of the story represented. I would like to interview the state legal councils, so the lawyers who, both men and women, who represent the state in those cases that reach the European Court of Human Rights. So how do they respond to those cases? Do they treat it just as part of their job and everyday job, or is there some more conviction in that representation? Why do they do that job? Is it just a job, or is it more so ideology? Is it also the need to serve the states? How do those different positions on the side of the state legal councils been filled, and how have they been changing depending on the incumbent government, or have they been rather independent? Is the idea of protecting your own state in the dispute before the European Court of Human Rights detached from the political reshuffling, or is it more as a civil servant type of role, I would say, or is it very much attached to and reflects the different political coloring in the Polish parliament? So yes, definitely. I would need the counterfactual, and I would very much like to speak to the lawyers and state legal councils who represent the state in the disputes before the European Court of Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Also to all, because I see that the chat was disabled. So if you only have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and we will address, Agnieszka hopefully will address them. So in the meantime, I think we should update our viewers on the situation in Poland, because you mentioned the judgment, of course, and how controversial it was, and it was published at the end of January. So I was wondering what happened since then, whether there are still demonstrations on the streets of Poland, whether there are new developments, and how the publication of the judgment itself affected the women's reproductive rights. Because before the publication, we knew that there was a debate regarding what happens next, to what extent the judgment is a real judgment, whether it's binding or not. So now we have the official publication in the official journal, and what happened afterwards. I think you may be muted.
Okay, Barbara, how about now?
Yes,
Yeah,
perfect.
sorry. I was playing with this and I didn't realize that I did mute myself. Apology. I shouldn't. Yeah, I should just keep my hands in front of me. Sorry. What I wanted to say is that since the publication of the judgments, we of course have a new development. Why? Because when the judgment was announced on the infamous day of the 20th of, or do I remember correctly? Was it the 20th of October?
22nd, I believe,
22nd of
Yeah.
October, when the judgment was announced. Since then, we knew in the oral presentation of the judgment that was posted on YouTube and that was filmed because of the COVID restrictions. People could not take part in the announcement of the judgment. We know that there were two dissenting opinions. In the final publication of the judgment, which from October till January, so November, December, 3 months later, we know now that there are more than two dissenting opinions. There are 4 dissenting opinions, if I'm correct. Definitely, the last time I checked, there were more dissenting opinions than the ones that were announced. And some judges who now are among the dissenters, so they concur with the judgment, but they provided a separate opinion because they think the judgment doesn't go far enough. So to me, as a social legal scholar, there is a clear indication that something happened to that judgment. That between October, when it was announced, and between January, the tone of the judgment has changed. We don't know whether it was because of the social protests that the actual judgment was tempered with, that the different voices, that the different argumentation has been sort of made more round, may not been so radical as on the 22nd of October, because that gave rise to those judges who said, sorry, but this is not the judgment we signed up to on the 22nd of October. There are judges who evidently say that this that the published judgment, as it was published in January, does not go far enough. And these are voices that sort of provide evidence that something happened to the text of the judgment within this 3 months. And that again demonstrates that yet another step at dismantling the independence of the judiciary, that the judiciary either caved in to the pressures of the protesters, which would be great, but I would provide a more cynical explanation and say that the judiciary caved in under political pressure of the dominant Law and Justice Party in response to those protests, in response to leave themselves, to give themselves a loop of maneuvering should that matter still come back on the agenda before the elections, before the parliamentary elections that are due in a couple of years' time. So, watch the space, but I think the topic of abortion will be coming and going because it is extremely controversial in a country, particularly like Poland, where there are lots of stakeholders, and the stakeholders have dug in their shoes very firmly on both sides of the political debate, and there is very little middle ground to maneuver or to find a compromise, I would say.
And Agnieszka, recently there was also a judgment by the Constitutional Tribunal regarding the mandate of the Polish ombudsman. Could you maybe also tell us a little bit more about this, or at least whether you think we should read these 2 judgments, recent judgments of the Constitutional Tribunal, in conjunction somehow? Should we relate them?
Thank you very much, Barbara. I thought I'm going to put this picture here, which you can see is from the protest in front of the Constitutional Tribunal and in many different cities that took place after the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal on the mandate of the Polish Ombudsman, Professor Adam Bodnar. And there's a picture, it's a very sort of symbolic picture of him taken on the, which you can see here on the right hand side of the picture. He's sitting on the floor. There are two flags, the Polish and the European Union flag, and there's an empty chair, which is the empty chair, which sort of symbolizes the empty chair of the ombudsman. So what basically happened with the judgment is that an ombudsman is an office that is supposed to be independent of the incumbent government. So whoever is in power. And the current ombudsman is elected by both chambers of the parliament. So it's elected by the lower chamber of the parliament, but the upper chamber of the parliament, the Senate, the Polish Senate, has to approve it. At the moment, there is the current political party, the Law and Justice, has got, together with its coalition members, has got majority in the parliament, but they don't have majority in the upper house of the parliament. So the upper house of the parliament has been the opposition parties have a majority. So at the moment, this leads to an impasse because these two chambers have to agree on the ombudsman, on the figure of the ombudsman, or who should play that role, because of the very nature of the ombudsman, that he or she should be apolitical. But because the discourse is so politicized, these two chambers cannot agree. So the Professor Adam Bodnar continued in his office as the ombudsman, even though his term has ended last year. As a result of this, a number of the Law and Justice, so the right-wing, the dominant party members, have sent a petition to the Constitutional Tribunal to check constitutionality, or whether it is in accordance with the Polish constitution that the ombudsman continues in his role after the end of his or her term. And of course, the Constitutional Tribunal said that no, the term has ended, which means we have, Mr. Bodnar is no longer, or Professor Bodnar is no longer the ombudsman, and we need to elect a new one. But due to the fact that this election is impossible, because the election would give us a very politicized constitutional ombudsman, that decision of the Constitutional Tribunal is also a symbol of yet another, I would say, or it's a symbol of the end of the independent ombudsman. It's a symbol of the end of the independent ombudsman, because the new one, if to be elected, would be elected in a war between the two two major political parties, or it would be a result of a new law that will be passed very quickly by the Polish Parliament, that will decide what are the new rules for electing the person to fill the ombudsman office, given the fact that both chambers of the Parliament cannot agree on one person, or on one independent person who would be just an expert in the field of human rights, in the field of consumer rights, etc. So all the different children rights, all the different things that the Office of Ombudsman is dealing with. So the protests at the moment in Poland are the protests against the politicization, the now very much outright politicization of the office of the ombudsman, and the fact that Professor Bodnar who was the last sort of independent ombudsman, has not been allowed to continue until his successor is being elected, means that we have no de facto de facto and de jure, no office of the ombudsman in Poland, also or the institution of the independent ombudsman in Poland is coming to an end. I don't know, Barbara, would you agree with that interpretation?
Well, he still has 3 months, of course, but I think it's a complex issue that I would agree absolutely. That being said, it is the reality. I mean, what will happen? We also have to remember that in any political system and in any political situation, it always is a political decision, and the parties need to make a decision in this regard. The problem is now that that there is such a polarization in Poland of a political discourse that this situation, and of course because of the controversies, speaking very diplomatically, around the constitutional tribunal, is that the situation is as it is. I would refrain from giving opinion on constitutional aspects of this decision, but indeed we have to see what is happening next, because the situation is also very dynamic, and I think that the political discourse in Poland or the dominance of the peace party is also becoming to crack. So I think that we will be witnessing quite a dynamic situation, or not. It is to be seen. I would like to come also ask about the maybe reactions of international community, or especially, or not necessarily international community, but Polish citizens in the UK, which are plenty, as we know, to those judgments, because regarding the first judgment of the Constitutional Tribunal on the abortion law sensu stricto, there was a wave of protests across Europe, also here in the Netherlands, by Polish community, but also by international community. So maybe you could also let us know what is happening in the UK, if anything is happening, and how the Polish community in the UK is perceiving the recent judgments and all these political controversies around the Polish ombudsman, but also abortion law.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So let me start maybe not necessarily with the islands, with the British Islands, but I will definitely talk about what's been happening in London and also in many towns and cities in the UK. But I would say one of the first sort of ways to take this Polish controversy around the Constitutional Tribunal decision was also at the level of the European Parliament. And here a Polish representative of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats presented a project of a resolution that would condemn that decision. And that also was sort of supported by the Congress Kobiet in Brussels, which is another social movement of Polish women in Belgium, who staged this protest from the Handmaid's Tale, straight from the Handmaid's Tales, or as you can see here on the left-hand side of the picture. And that resolution was passed at the level of the European Parliament. In London, we have, since the very first protests against the strict abortion law in Poland in 2016, we had a very strong social movement called Dziewuchy London, which is the London Gals. That's how you could translate it that's how you could translate it from Polish. And their logo, or I would say their one of the strongest graphic is the iconic double-decker London bus with a bunch of angry women who are kicking out the duck out of it. And the duck has also has a very symbolic meaning, because that's a play on the surname of one of the conservative politicians in Poland. So immediately after the protest, immediately after the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal in October, there was a bunch of protests, and they were both spontaneous, as you can see in the picture here on the left hand side, left bottom corner. This is a Polish embassy in London, so a lot of spontaneous protests in front of the embassy. Of course, in the first day, it was a protest that was announced with the London Metropolitan Police, and the protesters were protected. But later on, new protests were not allowed because of the pandemic conditions, so they became more spontaneous walks, sort of to say, and women were having different slogans, like, again, pointing to all these many stakeholders in the Polish abortion debate. So keep your rosaries off our ovaries, for instance, or RIP Polish women, etc. It's about choice. But also the protests became much more political to involve. So from the spontaneous protests, there were also much more political ones involving local British politicians. So there was this, which I pictured here on the top hand side of the top left corner, which was about sending a letter to your MP and protesting. So as a British resident, who quite often, many Poles in the UK hold double citizenship now because of the many years since the diaspora has been forming since 2000. So the new diaspora since 2004 EU enlargement. Many Poles have double citizenship, so they could send. There was this. Plan to send local MPs, our own local MPs, letters protesting. So that would lead to a critical mass and the need to address that situation in front of the British Parliament. But there was also a petition, or official petition, going on in the House of Commons, so the lower chamber of the British Parliament, going on, that again had a number of signatures, so that would made the government take some position on what is happening in Poland, and through that protect its citizens of Polish heritage, etc. But of course, these are limited. These were all fantastic ideas, but they are limited to the fact that, okay, the people who really need to address this issue politically are not the British politicians, but are the Polish politicians. So I think the protest will be mostly remembered as a very, symbolic protest and in solidarity with the women. Here's another type of action that was taken. So the solidarity with Polish women on strike in London. The logos were being posted on the Houses of Parliament, on the Tate Modern in London, but also here in the Polish district in London. Says, you break our laws, you break our arms, but you won't break us. And the lightning bolt, which was the symbol of the Polish strike, of Polish women on strike. So I would say the main feeling of the protest was very much a solidarity movement with the Polish women, sending a strong message: you are not alone, and trying to do with whatever political means they are, however they impact, would of course be quite limited.
That's nice to see this, of course, solidarity. It's always quite supportive. And I think at the wave of the protest, it was really supportive to see people all over Europe with their transparency and expressing this solidarity. Unfortunately, we are approaching to the end of our meeting, and there are still so many questions and so many issues to discuss. But maybe it's a big question for the end, but I think we should address it because one of the problem of these debates regarding women's rights, reproductive rights in general, and also it goes to the core, I think, to your research, is whether women's reproductive rights are human rights or should be considered as human rights, because we see that in all these debates and judgments that we see protest against, they are not considered as such. So what is your response to that?
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this question. Let me just move to a slide. Do you remember when I was talking about that the termination of pregnancy in Poland was legal in only 3 instances, and now the second instance has been taken out of the law by the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal, where if you look at the decision at the cases before the European Court of Human Rights, even despite the number of abortions in Poland is very limited, all of those 3 different exclusions have their own cases before the European Court of Human Rights. So in the first case that the pregnancy endangers the mother's life to health, it was a case called Tysiąc versus Poland from 2007, when a mother, Alicja Tysiąc, she had a diagnosis that if she gives birth to this, to yet another, it was very early pregnancy, she could lose her sight, and there was a danger that she could lose her eyesight. And none of the doctors in Poland was willing to actually do that abortion on the condition that she could lose her sight. It was not definitive, and it was just a possibility. So she gave birth. As a result, her sight significantly deteriorated. She's now in a receipt of disability allowance, and the case in front of the European Court of Human Rights decided that it was a violation of her right to private and family life, so Article 8. And so definitely women's rights in Poland or all over the Council of Europe are human rights. Here, in the first case, it was framed as right to private and family life. It is Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. However, in the other 2 cases, RR versus Poland and PNS versus Poland, the right was the right was formulated in even stricter legal terms. The denial of abortion was interpreted as against the right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment. As against the right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment, the right to be free from torture. So in the case PNS versus Poland, it's a matter of an underage girl who has been raped. There was a police investigation open to that rape, and she, as a result of that rape, became pregnant, and her mom was supporting her to obtain a legal abortion in Poland. However, media got involved, Catholic Church got involved, as a result of which the mother's rights to the daughter so the daughter was being taken into care, and the abortion never happened. As a result of that case has been taken to the European Court of Human Rights. And here the court decided that no, the way the girl, the underage girl, was treated in Poland by being denied the right to legal abortion in the case of rape violated her right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment. And the last case I want to discuss, which is the case of RR versus Poland. It's a case of it's important because, or I would say it's quite profound case, as it deals exactly with the decision that or with the Exclusion Act that has been deemed unconstitutional by the court in last October. So let me give you a background for this case. Mrs. R was 29 years old. She was married and this was her third pregnancy. And during the initial ultrasound scans, the doctors suspected a severe genetic abnormality of the fetus, Edwards or Turner syndrome, but they withheld the specialist test until the legal time for abortion has expired. So after the 23rd week of pregnancy, by which the fetus is deemed viable, which means no abortion can take place. And Mrs. R, what happened that the doctors waited so long? Well, she saw 16 doctors, both privately and within the national health system. She was admitted to several hospitals and clinics and even traveled to see doctors outside her own region in Poland. And on at least 4 occasions during her visits at different hospitals, where she received 5 ultrasound scans, she demanded access to legal abortion if the specialist test confirmed the nature of the genetic abnormalities. And she finally received a doctor's certificate confirming that a fetus had a chromosomal aberration indicating the presence of congenital defects, which can have serious impact on the child's normal development. And the doctor's certificate clearly stated that further handling of the case under the provisions of the 1993 law, so the abortion law on termination of pregnancy, can be envisaged. A relevant decision should be taken with due regard to the parent's opinion. But that decision arrived too late. That decision arrived after after the legally allowable term for termination of pregnancy expired. As a result, the woman gave birth to a daughter with a Turner syndrome, and the court held that this treatment of Mrs. R, so denying her the right to diagnostic services, not listening to her when she was asking for a right to abortion that was legal in law, that was then yet legal in law, violated the condition of Article 3, which is the prohibition from inhuman and degrading treatment in conjunction with Article 8, so the right to private and family life. And the European Court of Human Rights awarded her 45,000 euros compensation. So you can see here that the human rights, the women's rights are human rights as interpreted by the court within Article 8, so right to private or family life, or Article 3, prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment. But they are rights also to the extent that the state party to the convention allows for that rights to be, or allows for the conditions of abortion. Now that the second condition has been taken out of the Polish legal system, it really deems to be seen whether, if women apply to the European Court of Human Rights, saying that they have been denied abortion in Poland, even though their fetus could not be viable, and after a few hours after the birth, how the court will respond to this? This is no longer a law in Poland. This abortion, the right to abortion, is no longer a right to Poland. The court has to balance the so-called, which is called in the European Convention of Human Rights, the margin of appreciation, which means that the local governments are best deemed to decide what is a human right and what is not a human right, what is a right that should be respected, and what is something that may be in the interest of national national identity should not be deemed as a right. What I'm saying might sound really strange, but this was actually decided in the case ABC versus Ireland, where the court said that at that time abortion was illegal in Ireland, and the court said that yes, this reflected the moral aims of the Irish society, and the Irish society was best placed to assess the necessity of restrictions to meet these aims. And in the case A, B, and C versus Ireland, the court said that okay, these women were denied abortion in Ireland. They traveled to the UK. They had lots of complications, internal bleeding, etc. The court only, but at that time, the law in Ireland was that the life of the fetus is equal to the life of the mother, which is very close to where Polish legal system is dealing with, is coming to at the moment. So it becomes to me a really big question mark if more of the applications to women by women in Poland are made to the European Court of Human Rights as a protest against the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal, how the court will respond to them, knowing that we have this powerful precedent from Ireland of A, B, and C versus Ireland, where the court said, sorry, but this is what the Irish state wants. This is what the democratically elected government wants. This is what your constitutional says. So we can't judge against that moral aims of the Irish or the Polish society. And that very nicely brings me to my research, because I really want to interview the Polish women and say, okay, if you know the jurisprudence, if you know that the European Court of Human Rights hands are sort of tight, why do you still apply? Why do you still exercise that right to apply, knowing that the judgment might not necessarily go your way?
Yes, and I think it also answers my question at the beginning, how you will be expressing this voice of the state, and this precedent from Ireland shows also, or like the case of the European Court of Human Rights that you referred to, shows how dominant the state role is in this discourse. So it also shows us how important your research is to actually balance this dominant discourse. We have to hear the stories and understand why, whether from a legal or sociological or moral perspective. And I'm absolutely curious and looking forward to the results of your research. For now, I'm afraid we have to close our meeting. But let me thank you very much, Agnieszka, for all these informative explanations, for the slides, for the pictures, and again, compliments on your research. And I hope that you can update us sometime soon on the preliminary results.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That would be my pleasure.
Fantastic. And again, thanks for actually allowing for this voice of women to be heard through your research. So thank you very much, and thank you all for watching our session, and have a good afternoon all.
Thank you very much, Barbara.